This week, Australia played host to the Premier of China, Li Qiang, the second most powerful politician in China after President Xi Jinping. It's the first such visit since 2017. He's been shown around the country by Prime Minister Anthony Albanese, visiting Canberra, Adelaide and Perth. On the back of Albanese's visit to Beijing in November last year, the first PM to do so since 2016, a renewed and revitalised relationship between Australia and China is being celebrated by both parties. But are things really as good as they seem? What happens if we dig below the surface? On today's podcast, we'll look at the modern history of this turbulent relationship, what this trip has changed, and the role of pandas.
So Sam, China's Premier Li Qiang has just finished his trip to Australia.
Yeah.
And like you said in the intro, it is the first visit of a Chinese premier since 2017. And it's been quite the event. We've had pandas.
It's the big leagues.
We've had many long lunches that have been televised and big speeches.
Some 19-gun salutes.
Yes. And there's been a lot of commentary around the broader context of this effort to repair the relationship between Australia and China. Can we just start by you explaining why is it so damaged?
We're going to pick things up in the early 2000s, and that's when trade between the two countries really flourished, and China quickly became Australia's largest and most important trading partner. It was particularly important in the trade of Australia's mining exports, so things like coal and steel. And when you have two countries that are benefiting so much economically from each other, it can often bring with it a sense of stability and mutual benefit. I mean, both countries wouldn't really want that situation to end because there's so much economic benefit. So China and Australia largely, for the early 2000s, left each other alone.
Money and trade are clearly major themes here. Can you just give me a sense of financially, economically, how much are we talking?
I cannot explain enough how important China is to Australia's economy. So right now, China buys a third of Australia's exports and supplies a quarter of Australia's imports. So no matter which way you look at it, this is a vital relationship. Trade between Australia and China reached $327 billion last year, and it's now 15 years in a row of China as Australia's largest trading partner, export market, and source of import goods.
$327 billion. It's a hard number.
It's a lot of billion.
TLDR, we really need China economically. But things did start to change around 2018, 2019, didn't they?
As I was researching for this topic, I was thinking about personal relationships and how when a relationship breaks down, it is often hard to pinpoint the exact moment where things turn the other way.
That's amazing, comparing China's relationship with Australia with your past relationships.
Well, yeah, geopolitical relationships and personal relationships, kind of the same.
Many comparisons.
So there were a mix of factors in the breakdown of the relationship. One of the major points of contention was Australia's rejection of an application submitted by Huawei, which is a Chinese phone network. And Huawei wanted to participate in the 5G network rollout alongside companies like Telstra and Optus. But because of Australia's government's concerns that it was a national security risk to have a Chinese company embedded in a key piece of national infrastructure, that application was knocked back. And China really saw this move as Australia's alignment more with the US. And the US have traditionally had a stance on limiting Chinese tech influence. And I think we're really seeing that play out at the moment with TikTok. But things really escalated in 2020 at the beginning of the pandemic when all of our lives really changed forever.
So we're there, the big P word, the pandemic.
Yeah.
And tensions with Australia really escalated when Australia called for an independent investigation into the origins of COVID, right?
Yeah, so if you go back to the really early stages of the pandemic, so think kind of February, March, April 2020, Scott Morrison came out relatively early, think earlier than most other world leaders, and requested an independent investigation into where COVID came from in the town of Wuhan. And as a response to that, China put a number of sanctions on Australian goods. The big ones were wine, barley, coal and beef.
And when you say trade sanction, what do you mean?
It's basically just a restriction on a particular good as part of an Australian trade relationship.
And so kind of like a financial penalty?
Yeah, and that can really put a strain on a friendship, especially when that friendship between two countries is based on trade, because these sanctions had a really significant impact on Australian exporters. Take the wine industry, for example. They're pressuring local politicians and people in federal parliament here in Australia to be stronger on China in order to benefit from their trade, and that can put Australian politicians in a difficult situation.
And so in the years after the pandemic, those tensions only continue to worsen, right?
There's no one reason still as to why it kept getting worse, but I will go through a few that have had a really significant impact on the tense relations in the past few years. So in August 2020, we had the arrest of Australian-Chinese journalist Qiang Li. She spent 3 years in China in prison for spying charges. She always denied them. Then a couple of months later, a senior Chinese diplomat used an address at the National Press Club in Canberra to reinforce what he described as China's hurt feelings over the COVID inquiry, and that was the exact phrase he used there. And there's been multiple ups and downs in the introduction and removal of trade tariffs. Now, one of the things that's really been brought up a lot this week with the Chinese premier in the country is the imprisoned Chinese-Australian businessman, Yang Hengjun, who has been given a suspended death sentence by a Chinese court after being arrested for spying. To zoom out and not just talk about the Australia-China relationship, but the whole world, geopolitically, the landscape is really shifting. So the US-China rivalry is intensifying. China is forming stronger bonds with Russia, and Australia finds itself in a really delicate position. So we need to strengthen ties with China. I mean, we've talked about the economics, but also we share a region with them. But we also need to maintain an alliance with the US, and that's proving to be a real balancing act for Australia. And one of the real points of tension for this has been China's actions in the South China Sea. Now, China believes that sea is its territory, but other parties dispute that. Now, on top of all of this, there's allegations of human rights violations by China against various ethnic minorities. There's some distress at the way China restricts freedom of expression, including free speech, the way it's alleged to have infiltrated multiple Western governments via its intelligence and spying programs, tensions in Hong Kong, tensions in Taiwan. There is really quite a bit there.
You know, we try to keep this podcast to 10 minutes. So
we often fail.
Yes. But by you just moving quickly through those issues, we absolutely don't mean to diminish just how significant
each one of those could do its own podcast episode.
Let's fast forward to today. We're seeing these high-level visits between Australia and China's leaders.
Yeah.
Albanese visited Beijing last November, and now we have China's second most powerful politician here in Australia, although he has now left. But what has changed?
Well, to go back to my personal relationship metaphor, if there was some dramas in the relationship, now's the rebuild phase. So we're dating again and we're trying to rebuild the trust that has been lost.
When I interviewed Foreign Minister Penny Wong last year, who has worked a lot on this relationship with China, I remember she used this line, quote, "We cooperate where we can, disagree where we must, and we have to engage in our national interests."
And that sentiment has continued this week. There's still an underlying friendship. That's what they describe the relationship as, that the leaders say can survive through tough times.
But what have the actual announcements been?
The countries signed a number of bilateral agreements. Now, one of the key agreements has been the opening of Chinese markets to Australian goods. So there we're bringing in the economy again. And the markets to have been particularly impacted with this agreement is wine and barley. There's also been big discussions about enhancing cooperation in education, in tourism, and in climate change. Education is our largest services export to China, and China is our largest source country of international students, and it has been every year since 2002. So universities and higher education institutions are going to be pretty happy hearing that an agreement has been reached.
And there's also been some more symbolic gestures as well, like the loan of 2 giant pandas to Adelaide Zoo, right?
That makes Adelaide the only place in the Southern Hemisphere to host giant pandas. Now, I know I'm saying this jovially, but the role of pandas in Chinese diplomacy is actually super interesting. It's not the first time that these kind of furry ambassadors have been used by China to build relationships with countries all over the world. In fact, there's evidence of pandas being sent as diplomatic gifts by China as far back as the Tang dynasty in 600 AD.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay, Sam, let's wrap this up. The title of today's podcast is Are Australia and China Friends Again? What is the TLDR?
The way that this relationship has changed in the last 6 months is that we aren't necessarily closer as countries in terms of what we agree on and what we disagree on. But I think where we are closer is the way that we communicate. And I think that is something that the two governments have improved, undoubtedly, over the past 6 months. There is something to be said about the role of pandas as well. Makes things a little more bearable.
But I'm going to wrap it up by saying the TLDR is that China and Australia's relationship is on the road to recovery, but I think your relationship with your exes is not doing so well. They should have tried the pandas.
Should have gone with the pandas.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Daily Aus, and we will be back again tomorrow.